Everyone looked away, except her. The soft hum of polished conversation drifted through the upscale Manhattan restaurant, silverware clinking lightly against porcelain, amber lighting casting a quiet glow over tables dressed in white linen, the kind of place where a single steak cost more than a week's groceries, the kind of place where people didn't come to eat, they came to be seen, and tonight, every eye had already seen him. Alexander Blake sat alone at a corner table, untouched glass of water in front of him, his posture straight but distant, like a man used to commanding rooms yet somehow invisible inside this one, whispers curling through the air like smoke. That's him, the one from the headlines. I heard he lost everything, why is he even here? And one by one, waitresses passed his table without stopping, their trays steady but their eyes deliberately averted, as if proximity alone might stain their reputation. Behind the service station, the manager leaned in sharply, voice low but urgent. No one goes near him, understood? We don't need trouble tonight, and heads nodded quickly, obediently, everyone eager to stay safely on the right side of whatever invisible line had just been drawn. Emily Carter stood at the edge of it all, her fingers tightening slightly around the worn order pad she carried, her uniform crisp but clearly well used, the fabric just a shade too faded to belong in a place like this, her shoes polished but scuffed at the edges, betraying long hours and longer days, and for a moment, she said nothing, just watched, her gaze lingering on the man no one dared approach, the man who didn't look angry, didn't look dangerous, just alone. Emily, the manager snapped softly, catching her stare. Don't even think about it, and she nodded, automatically, because that was what you did when you needed the job, when rent was due in 3 days and hospital bills didn't wait for kindness, when doing the safe thing was the only thing keeping your life from unraveling completely. But then something shifted, subtle but undeniable. Maybe it was the way Alexander reached for the water glass and paused halfway, as if reconsidering whether he even belonged at the table he was sitting at. Maybe it was the way the conversations around him grew just a little louder, deliberately louder, like a room trying to erase a person without saying a word, or maybe it was something inside Emily that simply refused to stay quiet. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself, then stepped forward. One step. Then another. Each one heavier than the last, as if she were walking directly against the current of the room, past the watchful glances, past the silent warnings, until she reached his table and stopped. For a brief second, she hesitated, the weight of everything pressing in, the job, the risk, the unspoken rules, but then she set the glass down properly in front of him, her voice calm, clear, cutting clean through the noise. Here, she said gently, meeting his eyes for the first time, you should at least have this. The room didn't go silent, not completely, but it shifted, like a ripple passing through still water, heads turning just enough to notice, just enough to judge, and Alexander looked up, truly looked at her, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes, surprise, maybe, or something deeper, something that hadn't been there a moment ago. Emily didn't look away. Not this time. And somehow, that was the moment everything began to change. Alexander did not reach for the glass immediately, not because he did not need it, but because the gesture itself seemed unfamiliar, like something he had not been offered in a long time, and for a second he simply looked at it, then back at her, studying her face with a quiet intensity that made Emily suddenly aware of her own heartbeat, steady but louder than it should have been, echoing faintly in her ears as the restaurant continued around them, conversations resuming just enough to pretend nothing unusual had happened, though the glances had not stopped, they had only become sharper, more deliberate. Thank you, he said finally, his voice low, controlled, carrying a calm that did not quite match the tension in the room, and Emily gave a small nod, the kind you give when you are trying to keep things normal even when nothing about the moment feels normal at all. Can I get you anything else? She asked, her tone professional, steady, exactly the way she had been trained, even though she could feel the weight of eyes pressing in from every direction. Alexander hesitated, then gave a slight shake of his head. This is enough, he replied, and there was something in the way he said it that made the simple glass of water feel like more than it was, like it carried meaning neither of them had fully named yet. Emily turned to leave, but before she could take a step, a sharp voice cut across the space. Excuse me, a man from a nearby table called out, his tone polished but edged with irritation, the kind that came from someone used to being heard immediately. Is there a reason service is being delayed over here? Emily paused, instinctively glancing toward the manager, who was already moving, his expression tight, controlled, but not toward the complaining guest, instead toward her. "Emily," he said under his breath as he reached her side, "I told you not to engage," and she felt the words land heavier than they sounded, not loud, but final, like a line being drawn in real time. "I am just doing my job," she replied quietly, careful, respectful, but firm enough to be heard, and for a brief second, something flickered across the manager's face, something between frustration and calculation, as if he were weighing consequences that had not fully formed yet. Behind them, the guest who had spoken shifted impatiently, tapping his fork lightly against the table. "This is unacceptable," he added, louder now, making sure others heard, making sure attention stayed exactly where he wanted it, and the room leaned in again, subtle but undeniable. Emily felt the tension tighten, not explosive, not chaotic, but sharp, precise, like a thread pulled too far. She turned slightly, ready to move back into the rhythm of the room, to smooth over the moment the way she always did, but before she could speak, a glass tipped at the complaining guest's table, red wine spilling across the white linen in a slow, spreading stain, and the reaction was immediate, chairs shifting, voices rising just enough to carry urgency without losing composure. "Careful!" someone muttered, but the guest waved it off, irritation now fully visible. "Are you going to stand there," he said, directing the words at Emily, "or are you going to fix this?" The manager stepped forward quickly, eager now, redirecting attention, but Emily was already moving, grabbing a clean cloth from her tray, stepping into the moment without hesitation, her focus sharp, controlled, the way it always was when things went wrong and needed to be made right. As she leaned slightly to address the spill, she felt it again, that same quiet awareness, Alexander watching, not with the detached disinterest she had expected, but with something else, something steadier, more present, like he was seeing more than just the situation unfolding. Emily did not look back this time, but she knew. And for reasons she could not fully explain, that knowledge made her stand just a little straighter, her voice just a little clearer as she addressed the table, restoring order where it had started to slip, holding her ground in a room that had already decided who deserved to belong and who did not, even if no one had said it out loud. The stain spread slowly across the tablecloth, deep red against white, the kind of mess that usually drew immediate attention and quick apologies, but this time it carried something heavier, something sharper, because every movement around it felt watched, measured, judged, and Emily could feel that same pressure settling on her shoulders as she pressed the cloth gently against the spill, her hand steady even as the room seemed to lean closer, waiting to see how far she would go, how much she would risk. "You should be more careful," the guest said, his voice cool, controlled, but edged with something that was not quite anger and not quite patience, something closer to entitlement, like the inconvenience itself had offended him on a personal level, and Emily did not respond right away, not because she did not hear him, but because she understood something most people in the room did not, that this moment was no longer about a spill. It was about control, about who held it and who did not. "I will take care of it," she said calmly, her tone even. Respectful but not submissive, her focus still on the table as she worked, restoring order inch by inch, the cloth absorbing what it could, her movements precise, practiced, but there was a quiet firmness in her voice now that had not been there before, something that did not ask for permission. The guest leaned back slightly, watching her, then let out a soft, dismissive breath. "That is not the point," he said, glancing briefly toward Alexander, as if the presence at the corner table had somehow lowered the standard of the entire room. "The point is that standards matter," and there it was, the line drawn again, subtle but unmistakable, a statement that carried more than it said, and Emily felt it, the implication, the quiet attempt to push someone further out without ever naming them directly. For a moment, no one spoke, not the manager, not the surrounding tables, not even the staff hovering at the edge of the scene, everyone holding back, choosing silence because it was safer, because silence never cost you your job. Emily straightened slowly, setting the cloth aside, and this time when she spoke, she did not lower her voice. "Standards do matter," she said, meeting the guest's gaze with a calm that felt almost unshakable, "and respect is one of them," and the words did not echo loudly, but they landed, clear enough, steady enough, cutting through the air in a way that made a few nearby conversations falter just for a second. The manager shifted beside her, tension tightening across his expression, but he did not interrupt, not yet, as if even he needed to see where this would go. The guest's lips pressed into a thin line, not used to being answered that way, not used to being met instead of deferred to, and he gave a small, incredulous shake of his head. "You are a server," he said, his tone softening slightly but not kindly. "Perhaps you should focus on that," and the room seemed to shrink just a little, the boundaries of what was acceptable narrowing with every word. Emily did not step back. "I am," she replied, just as evenly, "and that means making sure everyone here is treated with the same level of service," and she did not look at Alexander when she said it, but the meaning was clear enough that it did not need direction. For a brief second, everything stilled, like a held breath waiting to be released, and then the manager finally stepped in, his voice controlled but firm. "That will be enough," he said, placing a hand lightly but decisively on Emily's arm, not forceful, but final. "I will handle this," and there was something in his tone now that carried consequence, the quiet promise of what would come next. Emily nodded once, not arguing, not resisting, but she did not apologize either, and as she stepped back, she felt it again, that steady presence from across the room, Alexander's gaze still on her, not distant, not detached, but focused, as if something about what she had just done had reached further than the moment itself. He still had not touched the water. But now, for the first time, his hand rested beside it, close enough that it felt like a choice waiting to be made, and somehow, that mattered more than anything else that had just happened. The moment Emily stepped away, the room began to breathe again, conversations rising back into place as if nothing had happened, as if tension could simply dissolve if enough people agreed to ignore it, but something had shifted, subtle and irreversible, like a crack beneath polished marble, invisible at first glance but impossible to erase once it formed. The manager moved quickly, smoothing over the situation with practiced efficiency, offering apologies to the complaining guest, replacing the tablecloth, redirecting attention with the kind of controlled charm that kept reputations intact, but his eyes flicked toward Emily more than once, sharp, calculating, already deciding what consequences would follow once the night ended. Emily returned to the service station, her hands moving automatically as she refilled glasses and adjusted trays, but her mind was not on the routine. It lingered on the silence that had followed her words, on the way the room had paused, on the weight of what she had done, and more than anything, on the quiet presence she could still feel from across the room. She did not look immediately, not wanting to draw more attention, but when she finally allowed herself a glance, she saw it, Alexander lifting the glass of water for the first time, his movement slow, deliberate, as if acknowledging something beyond the gesture itself, and when he set it back down, there was a faint shift in his expression, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough that it felt like a response, like a decision made in silence. "Emily," the manager's voice cut in again, lower now, controlled but no longer restrained by the need to appear polite, "step into the back for a moment," and she knew what that meant, not immediately fired, not yet, but close enough that the distance did not matter. She nodded once, setting her tray down carefully before walking toward the narrow hallway that led away from the dining room, each step quieter than the last as the sound of clinking glasses and soft laughter faded behind her, replaced by the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant echo of kitchen noise. The door closed behind them with a soft click, sealing off the polished world from the reality that kept it running. "What were you thinking?" the manager said, not raising his voice, but letting the words carry enough weight to make their point. "We have rules for a reason," and Emily met his gaze, not defiant, not submissive, just steady. "I was doing my job," she answered again, the same words, but this time they felt heavier, because here, in this space, there was no audience, no expectation of performance, only consequence. The manager exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair as if trying to decide how much patience he could afford. "Your job is to follow direction," he said, "not to make statements," and there it was, the difference between what the room had allowed and what it demanded behind closed doors. Emily did not argue, but she did not look away either. "If following direction means ignoring someone being treated like they do not belong," she said quietly, "then maybe that is the problem," and for a second, the words hung there, heavier than they should have been, because they were not loud, not dramatic, just honest. The manager stared at her, the frustration in his expression shifting into something else. Something more complicated, like he understood the truth in what she was saying but could not afford to agree with it. "You are a good worker," he said finally, his tone softening just slightly, "but this is not about being right, it is about knowing your place," and Emily felt that land deeper than anything else he had said, not because it surprised her, but because it confirmed what she had already known, that in rooms like this, place mattered more than truth. For a moment, Neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to settle, and then he gave a small nod toward the door. "Finish your shift," he said, "we will talk about this later," and that was it, not punishment yet, not resolution, just the quiet promise that something was coming. Emily nodded once more and turned back toward the dining room, her hand resting briefly on the handle before she pushed it open, the warm light spilling over her again, the sound returning all at once, and as she stepped back into it, she felt it immediately, that same awareness, Alexander still there, still watching, but this time it was different, not just observation, not just curiosity, something more deliberate, like he had been waiting. And when their eyes met across the room, just for a second, there was no distance, no noise, no judgment, just a silent understanding that whatever had started tonight was far from over. Emily moved through the rest of her shift like someone balancing on a thin line stretched across open air, every step careful, every motion precise, not because she was afraid of making mistakes, but because she knew the margin for error had disappeared the moment she chose to act, and yet something inside her felt steadier than before, as if the decision she had made, however small it might have seemed to others, had anchored her in a way she could not explain. The restaurant carried on in its usual rhythm, glasses refilled, plates cleared, laughter rising and falling in practiced waves, but underneath it all there was still that quiet undercurrent, a lingering awareness of what had happened, of who had stood up and who had stayed silent. Emily avoided looking toward the corner table. For a while, focusing instead on the familiar routine, the repetition that normally made the hours pass unnoticed, but tonight every second felt sharper, more defined, as if the entire evening had shifted into focus. When she finally allowed herself another glance, she noticed something different immediately. Alexander was no longer sitting back in that distant, detached way, he was leaning slightly forward now, his attention no longer drifting across the room but fixed, intentional, and when a different server approached his table hesitantly, placing a menu down with careful politeness, he acknowledged her with a brief nod, but his gaze moved past her almost instantly, returning to Emily with a quiet certainty that made her pause mid-step. It was not intrusive, not demanding, but it was unmistakable. He had seen her, and he had not forgotten. A few minutes later, as Emily passed near his table with a tray balanced carefully in her hand, she felt it again, that subtle pull of awareness, and this time, before she could move past, his voice stopped her. "Miss," he said, calm, steady, not loud enough to draw attention, but clear enough that it reached her without effort. She turned, her expression composed, though her pulse quickened slightly. "Yes?" she asked, stepping closer, aware of how even this small interaction might be noticed. He gestured lightly toward the empty place setting in front of him. "I would like to order," he said, and the simplicity of the request might have seemed ordinary to anyone else, but Emily understood the weight behind it, understood what it meant for him to ask her, specifically, after everything that had happened. For a fraction of a second, she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of awareness, knowing exactly what crossing that line again could cost her. Then she reached for her order pad, her movement smooth, professional, as if there had never been a rule telling her to stay away. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady, meeting his gaze without wavering. Around them, the room did not fall silent, but there was a shift, subtle but present, a few heads turning, a few conversations slowing, enough to notice that something was happening again, something that did not quite fit the invisible order everyone had agreed to follow. Alexander spoke quietly, listing his order with the same controlled tone he had used before, but there was something else beneath it now, something warmer, more deliberate, as if he were not just placing an order, but making a choice. Emily wrote it down carefully, repeating it back to him to confirm, her voice even, practiced, and when she finished, there was a brief pause, the kind that could have passed unnoticed if not for the way he looked at her then, directly, without distraction. "Thank you," he said again, and this time it carried more weight than before, not just for the service, but for everything that had come with it. Emily gave a small nod, turning to leave, but as she did, she noticed something she had not expected. His hand rested beside the glass of water, fingers lightly touching its edge, as if it had become more than just a drink, as if it had become a reminder, a symbol of a moment neither of them had chosen but both of them now carried forward. And as she walked back toward the kitchen, the noise of the restaurant rising around her once more, she realized something she had not allowed herself to consider until now. Whatever happened after tonight, whatever consequences waited for her when the shift ended, none of it would erase what had already been set in motion, because for the first time in a long time, someone in that room had chosen not to look away, and now, neither of them could pretend it had not happened. The kitchen doors swung open and closed in a steady rhythm, bursts of heat and sound spilling into the narrow hallway each time someone passed through, and Emily moved with purpose, placing the order ticket carefully on the counter, her handwriting neat, controlled, as if keeping everything in order on paper might somehow keep everything else from slipping out of place. "Table 12, she said quietly, and the line cook nodded without looking up, already moving, already focused on execution, because in here, results mattered more than anything else, not reputation, not whispers, just the work. For a moment, Emily stayed there, her hands resting lightly against the stainless steel surface, grounding herself in the familiar noise, the clatter of pans, the low hum of conversation, the predictable chaos that did not judge, did not choose sides, it simply demanded that you keep up. But even here, she could not fully escape the awareness of what was happening outside, the shift she had felt, the attention she had drawn, and the consequences that were quietly building with every passing minute. "You are going to get yourself in trouble," one of the other servers murmured as she passed by, her tone not unkind, just cautious, like someone who had seen enough to know how these things usually ended. Emily gave a small, understanding nod. "Maybe," she said simply, not defensive, not dismissive, just honest, because there was no point pretending otherwise. The order came up faster than expected, plated perfectly, every detail precise, and Emily picked it up with steady hands, balancing the weight with practiced ease as she pushed back through the doors into the dining room once more. The atmosphere had shifted again, not louder, not quieter, just more aware, like the entire space was holding something just beneath the surface, something waiting to unfold. As she approached Alexander's table, she noticed immediately that he had not moved much, his posture still composed, but his presence felt different now, more anchored, less like someone passing through and more like someone who had chosen to stay. She set the plate down carefully in front of him, her movement smooth, deliberate. "Your order," she said, her voice even, professional, but there was a subtle warmth there now, something that had not been there at the start of the night. Alexander looked at the plate briefly, then back at her, his gaze steady, thoughtful. "Thank you," he said again, and this time, there was no hesitation in it, no distance, just quiet certainty, as if the words carried exactly what he intended them to. Emily gave a small nod and began to step back, but before she could turn away completely, he spoke again. "You did not have to do what you did earlier," he said, his tone low enough to remain private, but clear enough to reach her without effort. Emily paused, meeting his gaze once more, and for a moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade just slightly around them. "Yes," she replied softly, "I did," and there was no challenge in her voice, no need to defend herself, just a simple truth that did not require explanation. Alexander held her gaze for a second longer, something unreadable passing through his expression, something that felt like recognition, like he understood more than she had said. Then he gave the faintest nod, as if acknowledging not just her words, but the meaning behind them. Emily stepped away after that, returning to her duties, but the connection did not dissolve, it lingered, quiet but present, threading through the rest of the evening in a way that neither of them could ignore. Across the room, a few guests continued to glance in their direction, whispers rising and falling again, but this time, they carried a different tone, less certain, less confident, as if the narrative they had settled on earlier no longer fit as neatly as it had before. And near the service station, the manager watched, his expression tighter now, more focused, no longer just concerned about a single moment, but about something larger, something that was beginning to move beyond his control. Emily could feel it, the shift in attention, the quiet tension building again, but she did not step back, did not retreat into safety, because somewhere between the first glass of water and this moment, something had changed, not just in the room, but in her, and whatever came next, she knew one thing with absolute clarity. She would not be the one to look away. The rest of the evening unfolded with a strange kind of quiet intensity, the kind that did not announce itself but could be felt in every glance, every pause, every subtle shift in tone, and Emily moved through it all with steady focus, finishing orders, clearing tables, responding to guests with the same calm professionalism she always carried, but beneath it, there was an awareness she could not ignore, something building, something unresolved. Alexander remained at his table longer than most guests would have, his meal untouched for a while before he finally began to eat, slowly, deliberately, as if time no longer pressed on him the way it did on everyone else, and every so often, his gaze would lift, not scanning the room, not distracted, but returning to her, always returning to her, as if she had become the one constant in a place designed to shift around power and perception. The manager noticed it too. That much was clear. His movements grew sharper as the night progressed, his attention dividing between maintaining the restaurant's polished image and watching the quiet exchange unfolding in front of him, something he could not fully control, something that did not follow the usual script. Near the end of the shift, as the dinner crowd began to thin and the soft hum of conversation lowered into a more relaxed rhythm, the manager approached Emily again, his expression set, no longer cautious, no longer calculating, but resolved. "Clock out," he said quietly, his voice firm enough that it did not invite discussion. "You are done for tonight." Emily blinked once, surprised by the timing more than the instruction, but she nodded, not arguing, not asking questions she already knew the answer to, because the conversation in the hallway earlier had already prepared her for this moment. She untied her apron slowly, folding it with care before placing it on the counter, her movements controlled, deliberate, as if finishing properly still mattered, even now. As she turned to leave, she allowed herself one last glance toward the dining room, and there he was, still seated, still watching, his expression unreadable but steady, as if he had been expecting this, as if he had known how the night would end long before anyone else had realized it. For a second, their eyes met again, and something passed between them, silent but clear, not a promise, not yet, but something close, something that lingered just beneath the surface of everything that had happened. Emily stepped away after that, moving toward the exit, her footsteps quiet against the polished floor, the warm light of the restaurant fading behind her as she pushed through the door and into the cooler night air outside. The city felt different out here, louder, faster, indifferent in a way that the restaurant had tried to disguise, and she exhaled slowly, the tension of the evening settling into something she could finally process. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether she would still have a job, whether the consequences would hit all at once or unfold slowly, but for the first time since the night began, she allowed herself to stand still, to breathe, to exist without the weight of a room watching her every move. Behind her, through the glass, the restaurant continued as if nothing had changed, guests finishing their meals, staff clearing tables, the manager moving through his routine, restoring the illusion of order, but Emily knew better now. Something had changed. Not just for her, but for him too. Inside, Alexander remained seated for a few moments longer, then finally rose, his movements calm, controlled, as he reached into his jacket and placed something on the table beside the empty glass of water, his fingers lingering there just briefly, as if acknowledging the significance of the moment before turning and walking toward the exit. When he stepped outside, the night air met him the same way it had met her, cool, grounding, real, and for a second, he simply stood there, his gaze shifting until it found her again, not by chance, but by choice. Neither of them spoke. Not yet. But the silence between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt like the beginning of something that neither of them could walk away from. The night air carried a steady chill, the kind that made the city feel sharper, more honest, and for a moment, neither of them moved, standing just a few feet apart beneath the soft glow of the streetlight, the restaurant behind them still alive with quiet luxury while the world outside felt real in a way that could not be staged or controlled. Emily wrapped her arms lightly around herself, not out of discomfort, but as if grounding herself in the moment, her thoughts catching up with everything that had just happened, every decision, every risk, every consequence waiting just beyond the horizon. Alexander took a slow step closer, not enough to invade her space, just enough to close the distance that no longer felt necessary. "You left without finishing your shift," he said, his voice calm, measured, but there was something beneath it now, something more personal, less distant than before. Emily let out a soft breath, a faint, almost ironic smile touching her lips. "I think that decision was made for me," she replied, her tone light but honest, and he nodded slightly, as if he had expected that answer, as if he had already seen how the night would unfold long before it reached this point. For a brief second, silence settled between them again, but it was different now, not uncertain, not fragile, just open, like a space waiting to be filled. "You should not have had to choose between doing your job and doing what is right," Alexander said quietly, his gaze steady on hers, and Emily held it, unflinching, because she understood the weight of that statement, understood that it was not just about tonight. "That is how it works," she answered simply, not bitter, not defeated, just stating something she had learned long ago, something she had stopped questioning because questioning it had never changed anything. Alexander studied her for a moment, as if measuring something unseen, something beyond words, and then he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. "I left this on the table," he said, holding it out toward her. "I thought you should have it." Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it, her fingers brushing lightly against his as she unfolded the note, her eyes scanning the simple handwriting. It was not a receipt. It was not a complaint. It was a single line, written clearly, deliberately. "You reminded me what respect looks like." Emily looked up, her expression shifting slightly, something softer, something more uncertain flickering through her eyes as she processed the words. "You did not have to do that," she said quietly, and Alexander gave the faintest shake of his head. "Yes, I did," he replied, echoing her earlier words with a subtle precision that did not go unnoticed, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched her expression, brief but real. A car slowed at the curb nearby, its presence quiet but unmistakable, a driver stepping out with the kind of composed professionalism that suggested more than just a simple ride home, and Emily noticed it immediately, the way everything around Alexander seemed to move with quiet intention, even outside the controlled environment of the restaurant. "You are not who they think you are you?" she said softly, not as a question meant to accuse, but as an observation that had finally found its voice. Alexander's gaze did not shift, did not avoid hers, but he did not answer right away either, the silence stretching just long enough to confirm what she had already begun to understand. "Not entirely," he said at last, his tone measured, revealing just enough without explaining everything, and Emily let out a slow breath, absorbing that, letting it settle without pushing further, because something told her the truth would come, just not here, not like this. The driver opened the car door quietly, waiting, but Alexander did not move immediately, his attention still on her, as if this moment mattered more than whatever waited beyond it. "This is not the end of this," he said finally, not as a promise, not as a question, but as something certain, something already in motion. Emily held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a small nod, not fully understanding what that meant yet, but knowing she believed it. And as he finally turned toward the car, stepping into the life that had followed him even into silence, Emily remained where she was, the folded note still in her hand, the night stretching out in front of her, uncertain, unpredictable, but no longer the same, because whatever had started between them was no longer confined to a single moment, and neither of them could pretend it was. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the city moving forward the way it always did, indifferent to the quiet shifts that had taken place the night before. But for Emily, everything felt slightly off balance, like the ground beneath her had changed just enough that she could not step the same way twice. She stood outside the restaurant again, not in uniform this time, her hands tucked lightly into the pockets of her coat, the folded note still with her, worn now at the edges from being opened more than once, as if reading it again might change what it meant, or make it easier to understand what came next. The door opened, staff moving in and out, preparing for another day, another performance of order and perfection, but when the manager stepped outside and saw her, his expression did not soften. "I was going to call you," he said, his tone direct, efficient, as if this were just another task to complete. Emily nodded once, already knowing. "I figured," she replied quietly. There was no long explanation, no drawn-out discussion, just a few measured words about professionalism, about expectations, about decisions that did not align with the image the restaurant needed to maintain, and then it was done. "We will process your final check," he added, already turning back toward the door, as if closing the conversation also closed the situation. Emily stood there for a moment after he left, the weight of it settling in, not unexpected, not shocking, but real in a way that still required a breath to absorb. She exhaled slowly, her grip tightening slightly around the note in her hand, and for a second, she wondered if it had been worth it, if one moment of standing up had been enough to justify everything that followed. Then she unfolded the paper again, her eyes landing on the same line, steady, unchanged, and something inside her steadied with it, because even if the world moved on, even if the restaurant erased the moment as quickly as it had happened. She had not imagined it, and neither had he. Hours later, across the city, a very different kind of room filled with people, polished floors reflecting soft lighting, voices low but expectant, the atmosphere charged not with quiet judgment, but with anticipation. Cameras lined the edges, journalists positioned carefully, every detail controlled, every movement intentional, and at the center of it all stood a stage prepared for someone who did not need introduction, even if most had not seen him in days. When Alexander Blake finally stepped into view, the reaction was immediate, not loud, but unmistakable, a shift in attention that moved like a wave through the room, because whatever had been said about him, whatever assumptions had been made, his presence still carried weight that could not be dismissed. He stood there for a moment, composed, controlled, his gaze moving briefly across the crowd before settling forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly, not raised, but certain. "There has been a great deal of speculation recently," he began, his tone measured, deliberate, "about who I am, what I represent, and what I have lost." A pause followed, just long enough to let the words settle, but last night, I was reminded of something far more important than any of that. The room stilled, attention tightening, because this was not the statement they had expected, not the defense, not the explanation, but something else entirely. "I was reminded," he continued, "that respect is not determined by status, or wealth, or perception." His gaze steady now, unshaken. "It is revealed in moments when no one is watching, when there is nothing to gain, and everything to lose." Somewhere across the city, Emily stood at a bus stop, the noise of traffic surrounding her, unaware of the exact words being spoken, but feeling the echo of them in a way she could not explain, as if something had shifted beyond her line of sight. Back in the room, Alexander stepped slightly forward, his voice carrying with quiet authority. "And because of that," he said, "I will be making changes, not just within my company, but within the partnerships we choose to support." A ripple moved through the crowd, subtle but immediate, because this was no longer just a statement, it was direction, it was consequence. He did not say her name, did not need to, but the meaning was there, clear enough for those who understood, and as the cameras captured every moment, every word, the narrative that had surrounded him began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Outside, the bus pulled up, brakes hissing softly as the doors opened, and Emily stepped forward, one hand still holding the note, her future uncertain, her path no longer defined by the place she had just left, but by something she had chosen, something she had stood for. And as she climbed aboard, the city moving around her once again, she did not look back, because for the first time, she did not need to. Whatever came next was already in motion, and somewhere, in a room filled with power and attention, a man who had everything had just made it clear that the one thing that mattered most was the thing she had given freely, without knowing who he was, and without asking for anything in return.